Have you ever wondered what it means to truly have a father? Not just in biological terms, but as someone who steps in when life takes an unexpected turn, someone who becomes your protector, your guide, and the very definition of love. In today's story, we explore a powerful journey of transformation, where a man, scarred by life's hardships, quietly became the father figure in a child's heart, despite the pain, the struggles, and the deeply buried secrets of the past. This video is not just about family and identity. It's about the profound impact of forgiveness, the healing power of time, and the surprising ways life can offer us second chances. If you've ever felt conflicted about family relationships, or if you've struggled to understand how people can change, then this video is for you. You'll see how sometimes love comes from the most unexpected places, sometimes even from the person we once thought we hated. Stay with us until the end, because the journey takes an unexpected turn, and you'll discover how a story of loss and resistance evolves into one of connection and deep, unspoken understanding. This is a story of growth, redemption, and the ultimate realization that family isn't always about blood. It's about who stands by you when everything else falls apart. Make sure to watch until the end, as you won't want to miss the heartwarming revelation that changes everything. If you are not subscribed, I recommend subscribing and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support means a lot to me, and if you enjoyed this video, you can help me continue spreading the valuable lessons by liking and sharing it. If you like the topic of this video, please comment 1. If you don't, please comment 0 to let me know how I can improve and make better videos for you. Now, let's begin. This is a story that touched my heart deeply, and as I think about it now, the emotions still flood back. It's a tale about family, love, sacrifice, and the complexities of growing older while navigating the changing relationships with our children and their families. Let me share it with you in a way that holds all the layers of emotion and personal reflection I feel about it. Mrs. Dow, a woman whose entire life has been shaped by the hardships of rural life, shared a story that brought me to a deep understanding of the weight of familial love. She said, "I've spent my life in the countryside, working tirelessly in the fields. My husband and I were poor. We didn't have the luxury of education, and we both had to drop out of school to help our families survive. We didn't have the chance to dream, not in the way city folk did. But we knew what mattered. So we got married young and had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Despite all the struggles, they were quick-witted and smart from an early age. My husband and I worked our fingers to the bone, hoping we could give them a better life than the one we had. We wanted them to have opportunities, to not suffer the way we had to. Our son went to university, and our daughter followed suit. They excelled in their studies, earned scholarships, and both graduated with flying colors. They secured good jobs and moved to the city, where they began their busy careers. It was the way she said that last part that struck me. Busy careers. Youthful pleasures. It's such a simple phrase, yet it's laden with so much. The reality of children growing up, finding their path, and drifting away. For a mother, this can be both a joy and a sadness. You want them to succeed, to spread their wings, but a part of you always longs for the days when they were close when you were needed. Mrs. Dow's story echoed that. Her children became so absorbed in their new lives that visits home became a rarity. It was only during holidays or Tet that they would return. And when they didn't, Mrs. Dow didn't complain. She understood that they had their own lives to live, just as she had her own. As long as they were happy and healthy, that's all that mattered. Or so she thought. And then came the day when her son married, and later, her daughter did too. As parents, she and her husband felt fulfilled. They had given their children the best they could and raised them with love and sacrifice. And now, it was their turn to see them live their own lives. But that feeling of fulfillment shifted when her daughter-in-law became pregnant with their first grandchild. The anticipation of new life always stirs emotions, but with it comes a deep, unspoken fear. Mrs. Dow's son called her, his voice filled with concern. "Mom," he said, "can you come early to help? I don't know how to take care of a woman after childbirth. She needs her mother, and my mother-in-law is no longer around. Please come." Something in his voice broke through the quiet of her rural life, and Mrs. Dow didn't hesitate. She packed her things and set off for the city, her heart filled with love and a touch of anxiety. When she arrived, however, she was greeted with a coolness that she hadn't expected. Her daughter-in-law, though polite, didn't seem particularly warm. "You worry too much," she said. "It's not like the old days. We can afford to hire someone to take care of both the mother and the baby at the hospital." The words stung. Mrs. Dow wasn't expecting a grand show of affection, but she certainly wasn't prepared for the distance that lay between them. They weren't close. The visits back home had been few and far between. There had been little time for them to bond. Still, she had hoped that the shared experience of family, of new life, would bring them closer. But the walls were already there, unspoken and uncomfortable. She quietly tried to help, to ease the burden. But her daughter-in-law's preference for doing things her way was clear. In the few days she stayed there, Mrs. Dow found herself doing the lion's share of the work. Her son, as much as he tried, seemed content to let her handle everything. Perhaps it was his way of showing love, or maybe he simply didn't know how to balance his roles between being a husband and a son. One evening, after yet another subtle exchange that made her feel like an outsider in her own family, Mrs. Dow spoke up. "If taking care of the baby feels like a burden to you, then perhaps you don't see me as your mother-in-law. And if that's the case, I don't know where we go from here." Her words hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Her daughter-in-law didn't respond, simply changing the subject. It was clear that their relationship was more complicated than she had hoped. Still, despite the tension, Mrs. Dow continued to do what she knew best: care. She helped with the baby during those long, sleepless nights when her daughter-in-law's milk hadn't come in yet. She would comfort the newborn when he cried, make formula, and do whatever was needed, all the while trying not to step on toes, and to respect the boundaries of a family dynamic that had never quite been built. I may be from the countryside, she thought, but I'm not entirely old-fashioned. I asked her how to do things because I knew it was her baby, not mine. But still, I worried. I worried that our views on raising children might clash, as they often do when time changes everything. I only wanted to help, to support her as a mother, and as a mother-in-law, even if it felt like a role I hadn't quite earned yet. Looking back now, I see the layers of emotion in Mrs. Dow's words. There's the tenderness of a mother's love, the quiet sacrifice of a life spent putting others first, and the heartbreaking realization that her role in the family was changing in ways she hadn't expected. And there's the hope, the unwavering hope, that no matter how far apart they seemed, they would find their way to understanding, to closeness, to connection. Because, in the end, isn't that what all of us want as we grow older? To feel that we still matter, that we still belong, and that the love we give is never in vain. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. A few days after I arrived, my daughter-in-law, ever determined, began to regain her strength. She quickly resumed her daily tasks: cooking, caring for the baby, and even cleaning the bottles. I could see the weariness in her eyes, so I gently suggested she rest for a while, but she brushed it off. "We live in a scientific era now," she said, her tone a little too firm. "It's not like the old days when resting was the solution for everything. Resting too much could even make you sick." Her words stung, though I knew she didn't mean it harshly. Still, something about her tone made me feel like I was out of step with the times when my care and concern were being dismissed. One night, while I was trying to fall asleep, I heard raised voices from the other room. It was my son and daughter-in-law, and it was clear that she was upset. "I told you to let me hire someone, but you insisted on having your mother do it," she said, her voice trembling with frustration. "She's from the countryside and has different habits. She treats me like a child. If you don't want to hire someone, then I'll just do it all myself." The hurt in her voice was unmistakable, and it cut through me like a knife. I could hear my son's voice trying to calm her down, but the argument only grew louder, until it reached a point where the baby started crying from the noise. I felt an intense urge to intervene, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the fear of making things worse. But I couldn't ignore the pang of hurt in my heart. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It wasn't just the argument that troubled me. It was the realization that my daughter-in-law might not want me there, even though we hadn't had any major clashes. There were unspoken things between us, things I couldn't fully grasp, but I could feel the tension. She had never directly told me, but the way she spoke and carried herself suggested that she didn't feel at ease in my presence. If she truly needed me, I would stay as long as she required, but it was becoming clear that she didn't need me the way I thought. It was painful to admit, but I couldn't ignore the reality. Meanwhile, back in my hometown, my husband was struggling to manage everything on his own. The thought of him dealing with everything without me tugged at my heart, but I knew I had chosen to be here. When I woke up the next morning, the air in the house felt heavy. The argument from the night before still lingered in the silence. I quietly packed my things, determined to make breakfast for the family before leaving. As I moved about the kitchen, I couldn't help but notice the signs of the previous night's emotions on my daughter-in-law. Her eyes were swollen, the remnants of tears still visible on her face. My son, too, seemed quieter than usual, eating his breakfast without his usual cheer. I cleared my throat and spoke, my voice gentle but firm. "Last night, I overheard you two arguing," I said softly, my heart aching. "I'm disappointed. I came here to help, not to create tension. If you're not comfortable with me staying, I'll go back to the countryside. Honestly, I feel more at home there, and there's plenty for me to do." My son looked up at me, his face a mixture of regret and concern. "Don't worry, Mom," he said, his voice tender. "It was just a misunderstanding. Stay a little longer, please. After the baby's 1-month celebration, we'll bring him to visit you." His words were meant to reassure me, but they only made the ache in my chest grow stronger. I nodded, agreeing to stay a bit longer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was not where I truly wanted. Still, I couldn't turn my back on them entirely. I gently added, "If you need help, I think it might be time to hire someone. You shouldn't feel like you have to do everything yourself." A few days later, my son sent me a message that I'll never forget. "Sorry, Mom. I didn't treat you well. I didn't mean to make you feel bad. Please forgive me. When the baby is older, we'll take him to visit you." Those words brought me a sense of relief, a balm for the rawness I had been feeling. I could feel the warmth of my son's love again, and for a moment, the weight in my heart lifted. Still, I couldn't ignore the fact that relationships, especially between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law, were never easy. There was a fine line between wanting to help and being in the way. But perhaps in time, we would find a way to understand each other better. Maybe we would learn to navigate these complex emotions, these unspoken tensions. For now, I chose to forgive, to let go of the hurt, and to embrace the love that was still there, however imperfectly it was expressed. Mother-in-law and daughter-in-law relationships can indeed be harmonious when built on mutual respect and understanding, but living together for extended periods can sometimes strain even the best of relationships. The pressures of day-to-day life and the constant proximity can turn minor irritations into major conflicts. In my view, the ideal situation is one where everyone maintains a healthy amount of space, allowing each person to preserve their sense of individuality and peace. It's perfectly fine for grandparents to visit their grandchildren now and then, offering love and wisdom in small doses, and similarly, parents can enjoy their time with the younger generation when the children are free. This creates the perfect balance, frequent but not overwhelming visits, where everyone can enjoy the relationship without the pressure of cohabiting. In this way, bonds grow stronger and more meaningful, and the atmosphere remains light, nurturing, and full of joy. When it comes to cultural differences, I think there is so much to learn from the Western perspective on independence. In many Western countries, parents have a clear understanding that their responsibility ends when their children reach adulthood, and at that point, their children are expected to strike out on their own, build their own lives, and contribute to society. This dynamic allows parents to reclaim their own time, focus on their well-being, and explore their interests, which I truly believe is healthy for both parties. They can travel, enjoy hobbies, and simply live without the constant worry of being needed. It's a cycle of freedom and rejuvenation. Unfortunately, in many Eastern cultures, including my own, there's often a deep sense of duty that extends far beyond the time when children reach adulthood. Parents, especially in places like Vietnam, continue to provide financial and caregiving support to their grown children, even well into their retirement years. This sense of obligation, although rooted in love, can create a dangerous imbalance, leading to emotional strain, dependency, and a lack of appreciation from adult children who may take it for granted. While we might share a bond with our children, the relationship with our sons or daughters-in-law can sometimes feel more complicated. These are the people who, while family, often don't have the same deep, unconditional connection that we feel with our children. The dynamics between in-laws can often be fraught with misunderstanding or unspoken tension, which makes it all the more important to keep a respectful distance. At times, it's better to preserve harmony by not living under one roof. A few days of visiting can be refreshing and appreciated, but long-term cohabitation has the potential to breed resentment. When conflicts arise, as they inevitably do, it can feel impossible to find a resolution that satisfies everyone. I believe that once tension builds up to a certain point, the damage is done. It's hard to go back to the peaceful, loving dynamic that existed before. I've seen families torn apart by the simple failure to recognize that space and personal boundaries are crucial. And so, for the sake of peace and longevity of relationships, elderly people, in my opinion, should limit their stays to short visits, weeks, not months, so as not to let any emotional cracks grow into deep fissures that can't be mended. The story of Mr. Nguyen Van Du, a 69-year-old from Ton Hoa, is one that resonates with me. He and his wife made the difficult decision to sell their house and move to the city to live with their children, hoping it would be a new chapter filled with love and support. But in his confession, there's a palpable sense of regret. Mr. Du's decision to sell their home, which they had worked hard for over the years, was driven by a desire to be close to their children. But as time passed, he realized that this decision didn't bring the happiness he expected. The city life wasn't as comforting as he thought it would be. His children had their own lives, and their routines, and the presence of his wife and himself only added pressure. The living situation became a constant source of friction, and instead of enjoying their golden years surrounded by the warmth of family, they found themselves suffocated by the weight of unspoken expectations and misunderstandings. This is a heartbreaking reality for many, when the dream of family unity becomes a burden. It's something I deeply fear, as it shows just how important it is to preserve your own space and your autonomy, even as you age. Our choices today echo through the years. How we live now will determine the kind of relationships we'll have in the future, and I believe that creating boundaries and respecting them is key to preserving love and peace in later life. The day his children finally bought their small apartments, a sense of pride mixed with unease washed over Mr. Du and his wife. While their children had moved into new, independent lives, there remained a lingering question. Where would they, the parents, go? After much debate, the decision was made: they would live with their eldest son. However, the dream of a peaceful, supportive family home quickly unraveled. Living together in the same space only deepened the discomfort. The sons and daughters-in-law, despite their best efforts, never truly got along. There was an invisible barrier of tension between them that made the parents feel like strangers in their own family. What they had hoped would be a warm, nurturing environment instead became a daily struggle. They had spent their entire lives working tirelessly to support their children, sacrificing their happiness along the way. But now, in the twilight years of their lives, It seemed that the very children they had devoted so much of themselves to couldn't provide the comfort and peace they had hoped for. It was a bitter reality. Still giving, still helping, but at the expense of their joy and well-being. And then, the loneliness became even more unbearable after Mr. Due's wife passed away. The grief of losing her was indescribable, but what haunted him most was the painful truth that her final days had been spent in a cold, impersonal city hospital, far from home. It wasn't how either of them had imagined it. His wife had longed to die in the familiar comfort of the countryside, surrounded by the warmth of family, but she never had that chance. Her days were spent in sterile, lonely surroundings, with only the occasional, distant phone call from relatives who couldn't visit because they lived too far away. It felt so wrong. Her death should have been at home, where she could have felt the embrace of love, not confined to a sterile bed in a bustling city. In her final days, she had begged to return to the village, longing for the peace of the place she had once known so well. But her fear of burdening her children kept her from asking for too much. If only she had kept a small portion of the family's savings, bought a modest piece of land back home, and lived among the relatives who would have cared for her, perhaps she wouldn't have passed away in such isolation. It's a regret that weighs heavily on him, a regret he cannot shake. Now, he is left to face the world alone, living with his son but feeling more like a guest than family. The grandchildren, busy with their own lives, no longer come to visit. The children, though they've done well for themselves, no longer have time to sit and talk with him, leaving him to retreat into the quiet of his thoughts. Every evening, he goes down to the apartment lobby, gazing up at the sky as he reflects on his future. The thought that haunts him most is the fear of ending up like his wife, isolated, forgotten, longing for a peaceful end in the embrace of loved ones. Will he, too, die alone in a place far from where his heart truly belongs? The sadness is palpable, an ever-present companion that colors his every day. He dreams of a final chapter spent in the company of family and the familiar faces of the village, where he can live out his days with dignity, surrounded by the love he had once given so freely. But now, as the years slip by, that dream seems as distant as the stars he gazes up at. He deeply regretted the day he sold all the land and their home in the countryside to move to the city with his children. It was a decision driven by the desire to be closer to them, to feel needed and loved, and perhaps to experience the comfort of living near those he had spent his entire life raising. The truth is, many elderly people share this same longing, to be near their children, to feel secure in the belief that family will provide for them as they grow older. And the children, perhaps out of a sense of duty or convenience, often agree, believing that proximity equals care. But the reality, as painful as it is to admit, is far more complicated. In many cases, what they discover is that material support, things like money, food, and shelter, simply cannot fill the emotional void that begins to emerge. What these elderly parents need more than anything isn't just a roof over their heads or material gifts. They need love, genuine care, and attention. They crave meaningful connection, even something as simple as a conversation, a kind word, or just someone to sit with them in silence. Unfortunately, too often their children forget this truth. Today, I had a meeting with a customer, Mr. Liu, who is in his early 70s and battling a serious illness. He came to me seeking advice about selling a piece of land to raise money for his medical treatment. His story, and his struggle, lingered in my mind long after I left. Mr. Liu's life had once been filled with hope and prosperity. He and his late wife had worked tirelessly to build a comfortable life. They had 2 sons, both of whom had grown up to be successful men. Together, they built homes, acquired land, and earned the respect of their community. Their family, by all outward appearances, was the epitome of success, a life many would have envied. They had wealth, they had property, they had security. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. But life has a way of shifting everything you take for granted. Suddenly, without warning, Mr. Liu's world shattered when his beloved wife fell ill and passed away nearly a decade ago. That was the turning point, the moment everything began to unravel. Before her death, when they bought land and built homes, it was a joint effort, a family working together, struggling together, celebrating their successes together. But now, with his wife gone and no one to share the weight, Mr. Liu was left alone, physically and emotionally, to navigate his old age. Their savings, tied up in land, were no longer enough. There was no pension, no retirement benefits to fall back on because they had spent their lives investing everything in their land, in the dream of a secure future. After his wife's death, Mr. Liu spiraled into despair. The loneliness was suffocating, and his health quickly deteriorated. A mild stroke weakened him, and a series of chronic illnesses followed, making it nearly impossible for him to move about freely. His fear of old age, of the inevitable decline that was creeping up on him, became unbearable. So, in desperation, he reached out to his children, hoping for some comfort, hoping that they would care for him as he had once cared for them. To ensure their future and ensure that they had a stake in his well-being, he divided the remaining land between his two sons. The eldest son, who lived with him, received a larger portion, but that decision only sowed the seeds of discord. The tension between the brothers grew. The eldest son, feeling burdened by the responsibility of caring for their ailing father, began to resent the extra weight placed upon him. He felt that he had already given so much of his life to his parents, and now, in their old age, he was expected to carry the additional burden of their care. He believed that the land division wasn't fair and that he was being taken advantage of, and this resentment started to fester. Meanwhile, the younger son, who had moved far away to build his own life, grew bitter over the larger share his brother had received. The once wealthy family, now divided and distant, had no room for compassion. The eldest son moved Mr. Liu upstairs, into a room in his own home, thinking that this would make things easier and more convenient. But convenience wasn't what was needed. Mr. Liu's world became smaller, his isolation more profound. His sons, busy with their own lives, stopped giving him the attention he so desperately needed. Even the relatives, once a source of support, stopped visiting, too overwhelmed by their difficulties to offer any help. As the years passed, the old man's condition worsened, and the emotional distance between him and his children became impossible to ignore. Eventually, after years of suffering in silence, Mr. Liu, following his children's suggestion, agreed to move to a nursing home. But when it came time to sell a piece of land to pay for his treatment, the eldest son and his wife flatly refused. The excuses were endless. There was no reason for them to sell the land, they said, even though it was still in Mr. Liu's name. They could see the money it would bring, but they couldn't bring themselves to part with it. This small plot of land, once a symbol of their family's success, had now become an insurmountable obstacle. And once again, Mr. Liu was left feeling helpless, as the very children he had worked so hard for, the ones he had hoped would be there for him in his time of need, turned their backs on him. His story is a painful reminder that no amount of money or land can replace what truly matters in a family. It is love, attention, and care that sustain us in our old age, not the material things we accumulate over a lifetime. It's easy to forget that, in our rush to build and provide, what we often fail to build are the emotional bonds that keep us connected. And when those bonds break, when they are neglected, no amount of wealth can ever fill the emptiness that remains. The law stipulated that her children were entitled to the property, a fact that seemed to offer a sense of closure, but it didn't bring peace. After I explained the situation to her, her reaction was heartbreaking. Tears of frustration and regret poured down her face. She had worked so tirelessly all her life, hoping for a future where her sacrifices would be appreciated, where her children would inherit her hard-earned legacy with gratitude and respect. Instead, she was left in a sea of conflict, the bitterness of which would continue to ripple even after her death. She might not yet realize this, but the tangled mess of property disputes would linger long after she was gone, poisoning the family relationships for years to come. The most basic issue was the division of the land. What was supposed to be a clear agreement was only discussed verbally, with no official paperwork in place. The official records still bear her name, a constant reminder of unresolved business that will haunt the family for generations. There are so many like her, people who have spent their entire lives providing for their children, even when their health began to deteriorate, and now, in their twilight years, they're left grappling with the harsh reality that their children, whom they gave everything for, are embroiled in petty conflicts over their inheritance. The pain of this betrayal, the sense of being taken for granted, is soul-crushing. These parents had hoped their sacrifices would be met with gratitude and respect, but instead, they are left watching helplessly as their children tear each other apart over material wealth, as if it were the only thing that mattered in life. I think of one relative in particular, my aunt, who lived a life marked by unimaginable struggle. She was once poor, so poor that she had to raise 2 children on her own while building a livelihood from the ground up. She moved far from home to the southeast, living on little more than scraps, all to ensure her children would have a better life. After years of toil, her children grew up and became independent. She thought she could rest, but instead, she handed each of them a piece of land, thinking it would secure their futures, hoping they would be grateful for all she had done for them. But what happened? Instead of unity and love, there was only tension and greed. The land she had so carefully divided for them became the subject of constant arguments, each child fighting for what they felt was their rightful share. The love she had worked so hard to instill in them seemed to vanish the moment material wealth was involved. Eventually, she moved into a small hut tucked away in the corner of her garden, living in isolation, surrounded by illness, poverty, and the quiet despair of her choices. A few years ago, the price of land skyrocketed, and one of her sons, desperate to pay off his debts, sold his share of the land for millions. He moved far away, leaving her behind in her hut, alone with her regret and the sharp sting of betrayal. Despite her hardships, she remained in that little hut, a quiet witness to the tragedy of her life. When I visited her, I felt a deep mixture of sadness and anger. Sadness for the woman who had worked herself into the ground, sacrificing her health and well-being for her children, only to be left with nothing. And anger that no one had taken the time to think about her future. She had no plans for her old age. There was no cushion, no safety net to soften the harshness of life's later years. Now, all those sacrifices seemed for nothing. If only she had kept a little land for herself, if only she had planned for the future, her old age would have been so much different. But instead, here she was, with nothing to show for a lifetime of hard work. It breaks my heart to think about how different things could have been if her parents had thought about the future too. If they had kept a portion of the land for themselves, maybe she wouldn't have been left in such dire circumstances. The mistake was in the hasty division of the land, done carelessly without any thought for the long-term consequences. It's heartbreaking to see parents who have spent their entire lives working tirelessly for the well-being of their children, only to find themselves abandoned in their later years, their sacrifices completely overlooked. It's a cruel irony that after all the blood, sweat, and tears, the inheritance, the one thing they hoped would be their legacy, becomes the very thing that tears the family apart. How can this be the way it ends? How can we let it be the end of the story? Certain members of my family have truly carved out their path in life, managing to build not just wealth, but a legacy that will endure for generations. My mother, for example, is a testament to hard work, determination, and incredible foresight. Over the years, she labored tirelessly to construct 18 small rental units, not only to provide for us and her children but also to secure her future. She made sure to keep a few of those units for herself, and even at 90 years old, she continues to live comfortably, her independence intact. Looking back, I realize now that she had such a brilliant plan for our family's stability. She was always thinking ahead, laying down a foundation we could stand on, even when we didn't fully understand it at the time. One of the things that I deeply admire about her is her thoughtful approach to how she divided the land. It wasn't just about financial gain. It was about ensuring that every one of her children, regardless of their background or gender, had a place. Whether they were boys or girls, expatriates from Vietnam, or local workers, she made sure each of us had our own space. That simple, yet profound act of fairness has been a cornerstone of our family's unity. It has allowed us to grow up with a sense of belonging, with a firm belief that we were always valued, no matter where life took us. Even today, my mother enjoys a life that many would envy. She has aged gracefully, and though her body may be frail, her spirit remains as strong as ever. I can't help but feel an overwhelming sense of gratitude for all that she's done, for the sacrifices she made and the unwavering love she gave us. There was never a time when she asked for money or needed us to take care of her. She chose, instead, to live independently, holding on to her dignity until the very end. And despite her independence, the bond we share with her is as strong as it ever was. It's not just a family bond. It's a connection that has been forged through love, respect, and the shared experiences of a lifetime. When she eventually passes, we'll sell the land she worked so hard to build, but it won't be for the money. The proceeds will go towards creating something beautiful, a place to honor her memory and carry forward the traditions she so carefully established. Because, in the end, it's not about material wealth. It's about maintaining the connection she gave us, the sense of security, love, and belonging that she nurtured all these years. There was a time when I thought of returning to the countryside, to the small village where I grew up. But every time I thought about it, I felt a deep, unshakable sadness. The village was so small, with only a few humble houses. It seemed so far removed from everything I had worked for, so dim and barren in its future. I didn't know if I could survive there again, if I could adapt to the smallness of it all. I wanted more than that. So I tried, desperately at times, to hold on to the life I had built elsewhere, to find a place where I truly belonged. Back in the countryside, I used to raise chickens. It was a hard life, filled with constant worries and fear of loss. Theft was always a concern, and so my father built a sturdy chicken coop right in front of the house. It wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of protection, a tangible representation of the security he wanted to provide for us. Every day, the chickens would wake up in their coop, lining up one by one as they walked across the brick courtyard, moving toward the garden to forage. And every evening, they'd return, crossing that same courtyard as if the day had come full circle. My father, with his quiet wisdom, would remind me every morning to sweep the courtyard, to keep it clean and orderly so the chickens wouldn't leave a mess or search for food there. It was such a small thing, yet it taught me so much about care, responsibility, and the beauty of routine. It taught me about preserving what's important, whether it's a family's legacy or a simple, humble life in a quiet courtyard. It was undeniably true. The courtyard right in front of the chicken coop, so simple and unassuming, was always impeccably clean. The chickens never seemed to return to stir up any trouble, which struck me as odd at first. But then, I began to think that they must have known, deep down, that the real treasures lay elsewhere. The best place to find food was not in that empty yard, but rather in the garden that lay beyond. It was as if they instinctively understood where their needs could be met, and it struck me with a quiet, almost poetic sense of wisdom. I remember one day, many years later, returning to visit my father. It was just the two of us, and the house felt eerily quiet, the kind of silence that only comes after a long absence. It was in that stillness that my father began speaking of the land. He pointed toward the farthest corner of the village, near the edge of the pond, and told me that the land there had belonged to our family for generations, passed down from my grandfather. He placed his hand on my shoulder and looked into my eyes, his gaze heavy with the weight of history. This land, he said, his voice almost trembling with emotion, is not just dirt and stone. It's our roots. It's the part of us that remains when everything else fades away. Never sell it, no matter what. His words felt like a sacred vow, something deeper than property, more like an unspoken promise that tied us, irrevocably, to our past. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. But then he spoke of the small plot of land just outside our gate, purchased by my parents, a piece of earth much smaller, too small even to warrant a will, he said. It was just enough to build a modest house, a place where any of us, his children, could return to when life became too hard. The weight of his words didn't quite hit me then, but I nodded along, squeezing his hand as though I understood. It wasn't until after his passing that the full meaning of that moment came crashing down on me, as if his love and care for his family were embedded in that very land he spoke of. The house, the pond corner, and that small plot of land all remained untouched after my father's death, preserved in time, almost like sacred relics. My siblings and I, thankfully, never had to return to claim what was rightfully ours, nor did we ever feel the need to fight over it. We had all managed to make lives for ourselves, to purchase our properties, to find our ways in the world. Yet, there was always this lingering feeling, one of quiet gratitude, that we were never faced with the kind of ugly conflicts over inheritance that so many others seemed to endure. It's hard to ignore the truth that moral values have seemed to erode over time, especially when it comes to land and inheritance. The conflicts that arise over property, whether between parents and children, siblings, or relatives, are heartbreaking and painful. People who were once close, who shared everything, suddenly find themselves estranged over the simplest thing: land. It happens everywhere, from the bustling cities to the quiet countryside. I've seen it with my own eyes, and the damage it causes runs deep, far deeper than any piece of earth could ever be worth. Yet, the sad reality is that this kind of strife has always existed, even before the mass media gave it a platform. What's different now is that it's harder to ignore. The cameras, the stories, they capture every painful moment, magnifying it until it feels inescapable. And yet, in the quiet moments of reflection, I can't help but remember the old saying, "Don't worry too much about the future, or you'll suffer in old age." Perhaps, like most old sayings, it holds more truth than we'd like to admit. My parents did everything they could to provide for us, raising us with love and sacrifice. But no matter how much they gave, no matter how hard they worked, we are all still bound to the same laws of life. Laws that are as inevitable as the passage of time itself. We all grow old. We all face the end, and we all must navigate the uncertainties of what comes next. Having money doesn't guarantee a smooth journey. Making the wrong choices, whether out of greed, ignorance, or even carelessness, can cost us everything. But there is one thing that remains steadfast. The laws of life, the ones that govern us all, are timeless. They don't change with the seasons or the whims of society. And if we can learn to live according to those laws, if we can find a way to navigate life with wisdom and humility, then we can protect our future, and even the future of our children. And now, I share with you a memory, a moment that has stayed with me, seared into my heart forever. It was when I was just a child, 10 years old, and the world seemed both vast and incomprehensible. I remember clinging to my grandmother, sobbing uncontrollably as I heard the news that my mother was going to marry a man who had only one arm and a face marked with deep scars. He was not what anyone would call handsome, and my childish heart was filled with confusion and fear. The first time he came to our house, he reached out with his remaining arm to pat my head. I recoiled in disgust, unable to hide my feelings. His face, rough and scarred, shifted for a moment, perhaps in hurt, perhaps in understanding, but then he smiled, that gentle, kind smile, the kind that only someone who truly knows pain can give. My mother didn't speak much in those moments. She simply stood by the altar, wiping a picture of my father, tears falling silently down her cheeks. My grandmother, ever the rock, talked with the man for what seemed like hours. When he left, my grandmother came looking for me. I was lost, adrift in my world of childlike selfishness. I felt as though I was losing my mother to someone else, to a stranger who had no place in our world. But my grandmother, wise beyond her years, took me into her arms and whispered, "One day, you'll understand." And maybe, just maybe, I did. At 10, we begin to understand life in a way we never could before, and the hardest part is knowing that people grow, change, and move on, even when we're not ready for it. That memory, that small moment of heartache and confusion, taught me something I never could have understood at the time. That life isn't just about what we inherit. It's about the choices we make, the love we give, and the grace we extend to others, even when it's hard. My father passed away several years ago after a sudden and tragic seizure, a cruel consequence of a bullet fragment that had remained lodged in his head from his time in the Vietnam-China War. The loss was devastating, leaving an irreparable hole in my life. My mother, grief-stricken and overwhelmed, decided to take me to live with my grandmother, a decision made when I was only 7 years old. It felt as though everything I had ever known had shattered in an instant. My father's death was hard enough to process, but the weight of the loss was compounded by the bitter reality that my 2 uncles, driven by greed, were now fighting to take the land my father had left behind. It felt as though even in death, my father's legacy was being torn apart. When my mother remarried, it felt like another betrayal. I was a child, too young to understand the complexities of adult emotions, but old enough to feel the pain of being left behind. I could not, and would not, accept this new reality. I remember the hours spent crying in my room, a feeling of utter loneliness and helplessness wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. No matter how much my mother or grandmother tried to comfort me, I couldn't stop the tears. I didn't want to come out, not to see her with him. When I couldn't hold back the despair any longer, and everyone had gone away for the afternoon, I snuck outside. My stomach ached with hunger, and I remember that desperate feeling of stealing a handful of sticky rice, trying to satisfy the emptiness inside me. But before I could even eat, he appeared. He was a stranger to me, and his twisted smile, which stretched across his disfigured face, terrified me. It was a smile I couldn't trust. After my mother remarried, my grandmother, perhaps trying to ease the transition, insisted that the man move in with us. I hated it even more. Every day, I had to live with him in the house. This stranger who wasn't family but was being forced into my life. My grandmother, in her gentle wisdom, told me to call him uncle, but I refused. It felt wrong, like I was betraying my father's memory, even though I didn't have the words to explain it. I was scolded for my refusal, but he, in his quiet way, just smiled at me sadly, urging my grandmother not to scold me. It was that sad, resigned smile that made me feel even more unsettled. I resented him with every part of my being. Living with someone I loathed was an unbearable weight on my young shoulders. Every night, I would watch him leave my mother's room, and it made my skin crawl. As a result, I ended up moving to my grandmother's room to sleep. One night, I reached a breaking point. I decided I would sneak into my mother's room and do something, anything, to make him leave. But as I crept in, everything I tried failed. He didn't leave. My mother didn't see it the way I did, and eventually, I had to give up. The deep sense of rejection and powerlessness was too much for me to bear. There were other nights, though, when the frustration would flare up again, and I tried to resist him in the only way I knew how. He was forced to sleep in the guest room at my grandmother's house, but that didn't bring me any peace. My bitterness continued to build until I began to hear whispers. Hoa, a boy from the village, started gossiping, calling me out for being too old to still sleep with my mother. His words stung, but they made me reflect, though not in the way Hoa intended. Eventually, I stopped fighting my mother's choices. I began to realize that this man wasn't going anywhere, and despite my best efforts to push him away, I had no power to change it. Yet, despite my harsh treatment, the man never showed any signs of anger toward me. It was almost as though he had resigned himself to my disdain, and in some strange way, I felt his quiet patience wearing me down. One evening, my mother bought him some wine, and he sat down to dinner with us. I pretended to ignore him, burying myself in the silence of my own making. My friends noticed the tension that lingered in the room, and it made me feel exposed, like I was being watched from every angle. It seemed like everyone was talking about me, whispering that Min hated him. And then, Hoa said something that still lingers in my mind. Maybe he should have a new father. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them see how much this hurt. But I kept silent, letting the words bounce off me as if I could just ignore them into oblivion. Then something strange happened. One night, as my grandmother and mother ran outside, shouting in panic, I saw the man with one leg standing tall. He was holding down a thief, an old beggar who had tried to steal from us, and he had help from a few young men. The thief was dragged away, but at that moment, I saw something different. For the first time, I saw him not as a man who had invaded my life, but as someone who was protecting us. His disfigured smile, which once terrified me, had changed into something else, something that, in that instant, made me question my long-held beliefs. Life with him was never easy, and it never fully healed the wounds of my childhood. But in that moment, as I watched him defend us, I started to realize that perhaps I had judged him too harshly. Maybe the story I had told myself wasn't the whole truth. Life doesn't always unfold the way we expect, and sometimes we find love and protection in the most unexpected places. And while I may never have been able to fully accept him, I learned something important about forgiveness and the complicated nature of family, something that still haunts me to this day. After that moment, something inside me began to shift. I started to feel a strange, yet undeniable sense of safety around him. I couldn't quite place it at first, but with time, I realized it was the beginning of something deeper, something unexpected. It was the anniversary of my father's death, a day I always dreaded, when the weight of loss felt too heavy to bear. Yet, that year everything felt different. I remember waking up early that morning, just like every other year, but this time there was a quiet determination in the air, as if the universe itself was trying to offer a little comfort. He woke up before dawn, silently leaving the house to head out to the fields. He came back later with a chicken, one that he would prepare for the ceremony in honor of my father. Meanwhile, my mother was in the kitchen, flurrying around to prepare the food for the offering. Her movements were swift, almost mechanical, yet there was a tenderness in the way she worked. When everything was set, he stood before the altar in his military uniform, his shoulders adorned with the weight of stars, symbols of a life lived with sacrifice and duty. He bowed his head, and with a reverence I had never before witnessed in him, he prayed solemnly for my father. His voice was steady and deep, filled with a quiet strength that made the room seem somehow sacred. Then he turned to me, his eyes softer than I had ever seen, and beckoned me to come forward. "It's time to honor your father," he said gently, his voice commanding yet full of kindness. I didn't question it. I simply obeyed, stepping toward the altar with a quiet calmness that surprised me. It was as though a part of me knew this was the right thing to do, that I was supposed to carry this weight now, not just as a daughter, but as someone who was beginning to understand the complexities of love, loss, and family. A few weeks later, something happened that I can still feel echoing in my heart. He handed my mother a small piece of cloth and told her to sew it into a bag for me. It seemed like a simple task, something insignificant in the grand scheme of things, and I didn't think much of it. I remember taking the bag to school the next day, completely indifferent, until my friends began to admire it. "Wow, this is beautiful," they said, their eyes wide with surprise and awe. The bag was simple yet elegant, crafted with care in every stitch. Suddenly, I saw it, not just as a piece of cloth, but as a symbol of something more, something deeper. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment below to let me know that you are still here with me. Later that day in history class, the teacher spoke of a hero from our village. She spoke of a man who had saved my father during the war, a man who had put his own life on the line without hesitation. My heart stopped when she mentioned his name. It couldn't be him, could it? But then, she spoke of his bravery, his selflessness, and the sacrifices he made. The pieces began to fall into place. The man who had been living with us all these years, the man who was now my stepfather, was the same man who had saved my father. He had protected my father when the world around them was falling apart. He had given him a second chance at life. And yet, Somehow, he had married my mother. The realization struck me like a blow to the chest. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't accept it. I ran out of the classroom, the world spinning around me, refusing to believe it. How could it be? How could the man who had saved my father have come into our lives, married my mother, and taken on this role as if he had always been meant to be here? My mind couldn't reconcile the two images, the hero and the man I had come to call uncle. That night, I found myself walking along the dike, lost in my thoughts, trying to make sense of it all. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the water. I felt torn apart, caught between the love I had for this man who had given so much and the grief that still lingered for the father I had lost. As I walked, I wasn't paying attention, consumed by my turmoil, until I suddenly saw a cobra slithering toward me. I froze, paralyzed with fear, unable to move. Just as the snake was about to strike, he appeared, faster than I could comprehend. He lunged forward, killing the snake in one swift motion, his presence a force of protection and calm. I don't remember much after that, but the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the hospital. The bright lights were harsh against my eyes, and I heard the faint sound of my mother's sobs. My grandmother's voice cracked as she whispered, "Thank God you're okay." I could feel the weight of their worry, but my heart was still racing, my mind in a fog. I was frantic. Tears filled my eyes, and I grasped his hand with a desperation I hadn't known I was capable of. "Uncle, please wake up," I begged, my voice trembling. "Dad, wake up. You're my father, please." And then, through the haze of my fear and confusion, I looked up into his eyes that were warm, steady, and filled with a love that I could no longer deny. It was then, in that moment, as I held his hand, that I understood. My biological father might not have been there to hold me, but this man, this hero, this protector, was. He was my father too. And for the first time in years, I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. In the quiet after the storm of emotions, I realized that family is not just about blood. It's about the people who show up for you, who love you when you least expect it, and who protect you in ways that go beyond words. This man had been my father in ways I hadn't yet understood, but now, with all the clarity that time and experience can bring, I knew. He was the father I needed all along. As we come to the end of this story, I want to take a moment to reflect on everything we've learned together. Life can be unpredictable, and sometimes, the people who enter our lives unexpectedly can become our greatest sources of strength. This journey teaches us that family isn't always defined by blood, but by the love, sacrifice, and care we share. We also learn that it's okay to embrace new beginnings and to acknowledge the people who stand by us in our most vulnerable moments. So, what have you learned from this story? Maybe it's about the power of unexpected connections, the courage to open our hearts to new forms of love, or the profound ways in which people can impact our lives without us even realizing it. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please comment below with one thing you've learned from this story that you're going to bring into your own life. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more heartfelt stories and life lessons. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.